The morning my brother pinned on his Ranger tab, I wore a gray cardigan and let my father introduce me to his coworkers as the one who couldn't figure it out. I stood near the back of the assembly hall at Fort Benning, holding a paper cup of bad coffee, and I smiled. I smiled the way you learn to smile when you've had 20 years of practice pretending words don't land where they're aimed. "This is my son," my father said, for the fourth time that morning, pulling my brother Daniel by the shoulder like a trophy he'd just won. First in his class. First Ranger in 3 generations of our family. He paused just long enough to glance at me. "And that's my daughter, Claire. She works in an office somewhere in D.C. The man next to him laughed politely. "Oh yeah? What kind of office?" My father shrugged. Actually shrugged. "Government something. Nothing exciting." I took a sip of my coffee. It was true that I worked in a government office. It was also true that my name was on a plaque outside a door on the 4th floor of the Pentagon, and that 47 people reported to me directly, and that I had spent the last 11 years doing work my father had never once asked me about. But he didn't know any of that. And that morning, standing in a gymnasium that smelled like floor wax and institutional pride, I had decided, again, that today was not the day to tell him. Today was Daniel's day, my little brother, who used to follow me around the backyard in his 2 big boots, pretending to be a soldier when he was 6 years old. The one who wrote me letters all through Ranger School on paper so thin you could see your hand through it. He deserved one perfect day. And if keeping my father in a good mood was the price of that, I would pay it the way I'd always paid it, quietly, without a receipt. I should explain something about my father. He's not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel. He doesn't yell, he doesn't break things. What he does is much quieter and, I think, more precise. He decides who matters and who doesn't, and then he acts accordingly, and he never once questions whether he might be wrong. He decided when I was 17 that I was going to be a problem. I told him I wanted to go to West Point. He looked at me the way you look at someone who just said something embarrassing at a dinner party. "That's a lot of ambition for someone who cried when she couldn't open a pickle jar," he said. He thought he was being funny. He always thinks he's being funny. I got into West Point. I didn't tell him until the acceptance letter had been sitting in my desk drawer for 9 days. Because I needed those 9 days to believe it myself before I let him have a chance to take it from me. He didn't take it. Instead, he said, "Well, don't come crying to me when it gets hard." It got hard. I didn't come crying. That was 14 years ago. The ceremony was beautiful in the way that military ceremonies always are. Precise, deliberate, unhurried. I watched Daniel walk across that stage and felt something unlock in my chest that I hadn't known was closed. He looked so much taller than the kid I remembered. He shook hands with his commanding officer and stood straight, and I thought, "We both made it, Danny. We both made it out of that house and into something real." My father cried. I had never seen my father cry before. He pressed 2 fingers to the corner of his eye like he was trying to push the tear back in, and for a moment I felt something almost like softness toward him. Almost. After the ceremony, there was a reception in a side room with folding tables and a sheet cake and people milling around with their phones out taking pictures. My father found me by the coffee station. I seemed to spend most of that day near coffee. And he lowered his voice the way he does when he wants to make sure everyone nearby can still hear him. "I'm proud of your brother," he said. "Me too," I said. He had the right instincts, knew what he wanted and went after it. A pause. "Some people drift. It's not a criticism, just an observation." I looked at him. He was looking at the sheet cake. "I don't feel like I've drifted," I said carefully. "Claire." He said my name like it was a gentle correction. "You've been in the same mid-level position for years. Your mother and I worry. That's all. Mid-level." I thought about the briefing I'd given 2 weeks ago. I thought about the 3-star general who'd shaken my hand afterward and said quietly that it was the clearest strategic analysis he'd heard in a decade. I thought about my security clearance, which had levels my father didn't know existed. "I appreciate the concern," I said. He patted my shoulder. "We just want you to find your footing eventually. It's not too late. Plenty of people reinvent themselves at 32. I was 34, but I let it go. Daniel found me 20 minutes later, a plate of cake in each hand, his Ranger tab bright on his sleeve. He handed me one of the plates and stood beside me, looking out at the room. "You good?" he said. "I'm good." He was quiet for a moment. Daniel has always been better at silence than most people. It's one of the things that made him a good soldier. Dad doing the thing? Dad's doing the thing. He exhaled slowly. "You know, I told him 3 times that you work at the Pentagon." "I know," he said. "Everybody says they work at the Pentagon. It just means you work near DC. I laughed. "I actually laugh in a Camegan. It just means you work near DC. I laughed. I actually laughed, and it surprised both of us. That is so specifically him. "Claire." Daniel turned to look at me. He has our mother's eyes, dark and direct. "You don't have to protect me anymore. I'm not 6. I know you're not 6. "Then why? Because today is yours," I said, "and I'm not going to let anything take that away. Not even making a point." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once and ate his cake and didn't say anything else. That's the thing about Daniel. He disagrees with me a lot. But he also trusts me, and he knows when I've made a decision. What neither of us had accounted for was Colonel Bridges. Colonel Bridges was Daniel's battalion commander, a broad-shouldered man from Georgia with a white-gray crew cut and the kind of posture that makes other people unconsciously straighten up when he walks into a room. I'd met him once before, briefly, at an interagency coordination meeting 8 months earlier. He had been sharp, prepared, unflinching, the kind of officer I genuinely respected. I had hoped very much that he would not be at this reception. He was at this reception. I saw him across the room and turned slightly, positioning myself behind a taller man in a blue blazer, which was ridiculous and also completely instinctive. I had 2 more hours. That was all I needed. 2 more hours and my father would get in his rental car and drive to the airport, and the day would be over and everything would stay the way I had decided it should stay. "Rogers." The voice came from directly behind me. I closed my eyes for one breath, opened them, turned around. Colonel Bridges was looking at me with the particular expression of a man who has just realized he's found something he wasn't looking for. His eyes went to my face, then dropped briefly to my left shoulder. "Have it, looking for rank?" Finding the gray cardigan instead, then back to my face. "I thought that was you," he said. "Colonel Bridges." I shook his hand. "Congratulations on your Rangers. Exceptional group." "Thank you." He was still looking at me with that expression. "You're here for my brother," I said. "Daniel Rogers. Charlie Company." Something shifted in his face. "Rogers is your brother?" "Yes, sir." He looked across the room to where Daniel was standing with a group of his classmates. Then he looked back at me. "Does he know?" "He knows I work in DC," I said. And then, because Colonel Bridges was not a man you could half answer and walk away from, I added, "Today is his. I'd appreciate it if we could keep it that way." He studied me for a moment. Military men of a certain rank develop an ability to read a situation without needing it explained, and Colonel Bridges was very good at his job. He nodded slowly. "Of course," he said. "I thought that was it. I thought we had an understanding." I didn't account for my father. My father had noticed the conversation. He had the radar of a man who is always scanning the room for confirmation that he is near the most important thing happening, and a colonel in dress uniform talking to his daughter apparently registered as notable. He crossed the room with a glass of iced tea and arrived at my elbow with a smile that I recognized as his company smile. Wide, slightly performative, deployed for people he wanted to impress. "I see my daughter's made a friend," he said, which was the kind of thing he said when he wanted to take up space in a conversation he hadn't been invited to. "Dad," I said, "this is Colonel Bridges, Daniel's battalion commander." My father's company smile upgraded immediately. He shook the colonel's hand with both of his. "Wonderful ceremony, Colonel. Just wonderful. Your men are something else. My son, Daniel Rogers, Charlie Company. He's been working for this his whole life. Kid was born for it. He's a fine soldier," Colonel Bridges said. "Takes after his grandfather," my father said, which was true and also something he said to everyone. "Military runs in our blood. Well, some of us." He laughed, the slight self-deprecating laugh that was really aimed at someone else. "Claire here went a different direction. Government paper pushing. You know how it is. Not everyone's cut out for the hard path." I looked at the folding table. Colonel Bridges looked at me. There was a pause that lasted approximately 1 geological era. "Mr. Rogers," Colonel Bridges said. and his voice had shifted into something I can only describe as carefully calibrated. "What is it you think your daughter does?" My father blinked. It wasn't the question he expected. "Oh, she works in DC, sub." "Oh, she works in DC. Some analyst position, I think. Government bureaucracy." Colonel Bridges nodded slowly. "I see." He looked at me. I gave him the smallest possible shake of my head. He looked back at my father. "She never mentioned what department." "You know how these government jobs are?" my father said, chuckling. "Vague titles, lots of meetings, nothing you can point to and say, 'I built that.' Not like," he gestured toward the room full of Rangers, "this." "Dad," I said quietly, "I'm just being honest, sweetheart. You always said you wanted to serve your country. There are different ways to do that. No shame in finding a comfortable lane." Comfortable lane. 11 years. 4 deployments in a support capacity that I am still not able to fully describe in public. A master's degree finished on nights and weekends while managing a team that didn't sleep. A commendation I keep in a drawer because there's no one in my personal life I've wanted to show it to. Comfortable lane. I felt something shift in me. Not anger exactly. More like the moment when you've been holding a door shut for a long time and your arm finally gets tired. I was tired. I looked at my father, who was smiling at Colonel Bridges, waiting to be agreed with, and I thought about all the dinners where I'd changed the subject. All the phone calls where I'd said, "Things are fine, just busy." All the moments I'd smoothed over to keep the peace. And I thought, this is the last one. But I didn't say anything. Not yet, because my choice had been made and I was going to honor it, and what happened next was not something I planned. Colonel Bridges straightened. Not dramatically, just a small shift in posture. The kind that career military men make when they are choosing to be very deliberate. He set down his own glass on the nearest table. When he looked at my father, his expression was polite and entirely sober. "Mr. Prosegret, Rogers," he said, "your daughter isn't an analyst." My father looked momentarily confused. "Oh, I've worked with her on 2 interagency task forces in the last 18 months. She ran the strategic planning division for an operation I'm not going to describe in detail in this room." He paused. "She's one of the most effective senior officers I've encountered in 31 years of service." My father blinked. "Senior, she's not military." "She commissioned out of West Point 14 years ago," Colonel Bridges said. The iced tea glass in my father's hand tilted slightly. He caught it. "West Point." He said it flatly, like a word in a language he didn't speak. "She didn't go to West Point." "I did," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I didn't tell you until after." "That's not." He stopped. Something was moving across his face that I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Recalculation. For 14 years you've been in the Army," I said. "Yes. But you said you worked at the Pentagon." "I do work at the Pentagon. I have an office there." Colonel Bridges, because he is a man of precision, chose this moment to be fully precise. "Lieutenant Colonel Rogers has been assigned to the office of the Deputy Chief of Staff for the last 3 years, he said. "Before that she was in Germany, and before that she was in places I'd need clearance to discuss even in general terms." My father looked at me. I had imagined this moment sometimes, in the abstract, the way you imagine scenarios you decided will never happen. I had imagined feeling triumphant. I had imagined feeling vindicated. What I actually felt was tired and sad, and something else I didn't have a clean word for. Something that had to do with all the years it had taken to get here and all the things that couldn't be given back. "Lieutenant Colonel," my father said slowly. "Yes," I said. Across the room, I saw Daniel. He had gone still, holding his plate, watching us. He had heard enough to understand what was happening. His face was doing something complicated. My father put his iced tea down on the table. He looked at the room, at the Rangers, at the flags, at the ceremony that had just happened, and then he looked back at me, and I watched him do the math. 14 years. West Point. Germany. The Pentagon. All the phone calls where I'd said, "Things are fine." All the Christmases where he'd said, "Still in that same position?" And I'd said, "More or less." "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. And this was the question I had been carrying for 14 years. The one I turned over in my head on overnight flights and in hotel rooms in places I couldn't name in this story. Why didn't you tell me? As if the answer were simple, as if I hadn't tried. Once, early on. A careful phone call from a base in Georgia. Nervous in a way I didn't let myself be nervous about anything else. And been met with, the army. Claire, you're going to break your mother's heart. And then a 10-minute explanation of why my cousin's accounting job offered better long-term stability. I tried to, once, I said. It didn't go well. He opened his mouth and closed it. I'm not angry with you, I said. And I meant it, which surprised me. I think you had a picture of who I was going to be and I didn't fit it and I got tired of trying to explain the gap. So I stopped explaining. You let me think. I let you think what you wanted to think, I said. That's different. Colonel Bridges had stepped back half a step, giving us space without fully leaving, which I appreciated. Daniel had set his plate down and was walking toward us, slowly, the way you approach something you're not sure is stable. Claire, my father said, I'm not asking you to apologize, I said. I don't need that right now. This is Daniel's day, and I meant what I said. I want it to stay that way. But I'm not going to be introduced as the one who couldn't figure it out anymore. I don't think that's too much to ask. Something in his face broke open. It wasn't dramatic. It was actually very quiet. A kind of falling away, like a wall that doesn't collapse but just slowly becomes less of a wall. He looked at me, and for maybe the first time I could remember, he looked like he didn't know what to say. Not because he was choosing his words, but because he genuinely didn't have any. Daniel reached us. He put his hand on my father's shoulder and looked at me, and his eyes said everything he couldn't say out loud, which was mostly, I've been waiting for this, and I'm glad and I'm sorry it took this long, and you're my favorite person. Let's get more cake, Daniel said. My father nodded. He looked slightly unmoored, which was so unfamiliar that it was almost unsettling. He let Daniel steer him toward the dessert table, and I stood there for a moment with Colonel Bridges. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know you wanted to wait. Don't be, I said. I think I needed someone else to open the door. He nodded once, with the economy of a man who doesn't waste gestures. I looked across the room at my brother, who was cutting my father a piece of cake with the focused seriousness he brought to everything, and at my father, who was standing slightly smaller than he had an hour ago. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time around this particular family at this particular kind of event. I felt like I was allowed to be there. The drive to the airport that evening was my father and me alone. My mother had flown in separately and was leaving from a different terminal, and Daniel was staying on base. It was 23 minutes of GPS directions and the sound of the rental car's turn signal. About 10 minutes in, my father said, Germany. What? You said Germany. When was that? 2017 to 2019, I said. That's the year your grandmother died, he said. You flew back. I remember thinking you seemed different. More? I don't know. Contained. I had been managing a 4-country coordination for about 6 months, I said. You kind of have to get contained. He was quiet. Then, I didn't ask what you were doing there? No, I said. You didn't. I thought you were there for work. I didn't know, I said. You didn't. I thought you were there for work. I didn't know it was. He stopped. I didn't know. I know you didn't. The GPS told us to turn right. He turned right. We drove another few minutes, and I watched the Georgia pine trees go past in the dark. And somewhere in the middle of that dark stretch of highway, my father said, I told Bill Thatcher that my daughter worked for the Department of Labor. At his retirement party, last year. Bill Thatcher was someone I had never met. Okay, I said. I made up what you did because I didn't know what to say. He said it to the road. And I made up a version that was smaller. Because I think I expected you to be smaller. And then you stayed that size in my head even when I should have asked. I didn't say anything. That's not an excuse, he said. I know it isn't. I know you know, I said. We pulled into the departure terminal and he put the car in park. The airport lights were very bright after the highway. He sat with his hands on the wheel for a moment. Are you good? He said. At your job. Are you good at it? It was such a strange question to finally be asked. I think so, I said. I've tried to be. Your brother says you're the reason he joined. I turned to look at him. He told me, my father said. Years ago, he said watching you go after something that scared you made him think he could do it too. He said it carefully, the way someone handles something they waited too long to pick up. I didn't put that together with what I thought I knew about you. I should have. I sat in the passenger seat of a rental car at the Atlanta airport and I thought about being 17 and pulling that acceptance letter out of my desk drawer and how my hands had shaken. I thought about my first week at West Point and how I'd called my mother from a payphone on a Sunday evening. Not crying, but very close, and she'd said, "You're going to be fine." And I believed her because she said it the right way. I thought about Daniel at 6 years old in 2 big boots. I thought about 14 years of phone calls where I'd said things are fine and meant it, and also had meant a lot more than that. I'm not going to pretend the last 14 years didn't happen, I said. I'm not asking you to. But I'm also not going to keep having a version of this conversation where I stay small because it's easier. That's done. Okay, he said. Okay, I said. He got out of the car. I got out of the car. He got his bag from the trunk, and I stood on the curb and he looked at me the way people look at someone they're realizing they need to look at more carefully. And then he said, "I'm going to call more." I'd like that, I said. And I meant it. He went inside. I drove the rental car back to the return lot and took the shuttle to my terminal. And I sat in a plastic airport chair with my carry-on between my feet and a cup of coffee in my hand. And I thought about how strange it is that the things we carry longest are always the lightest ones. Not heavy enough to put down, but just heavy enough that you never forget you're holding them. I didn't need my father to see me in order to be what I was. I'd known that for years. But I will tell you, and this is the part I didn't expect, it is a different thing to be seen anyway. Not better or worse than invisibility, just different, like a room with the window opened. I boarded my flight. The woman next to me asked if the window seat was taken. I said no. She settled in, plugged in her headphones, and fell asleep before we'd even pushed back from the gate. I looked out the window at the lights of Atlanta spreading out below us as we climbed, and I thought about Daniel's face when he shook that commander's hand, the way he'd stood so straight. And I thought, we both made it, Danny. We both made it, all the way out. I've thought a lot about why I stayed quiet for as long as I did. Not just that day at Fort Benning, but for 14 years. And I think the honest answer is that I didn't trust the truth to land the right way. I'd handed my father pieces of it once early on and watched him set them down without looking at them. After that, I stopped offering. That's not a heroic choice. I want to be clear about that. There was no grand strategy. It was just the quiet, practical decision of someone who had learned that certain doors, when pushed, don't open, they just make noise. So I stopped pushing and put my energy somewhere else, into the work, into becoming the kind of person who didn't need the door to open. What I didn't anticipate was what that decision would cost me, not in rank or career. Those things moved forward regardless, but in the smaller, harder-to-name ways. The Christmases where I sat at the table and nodded while my father talked about Daniel's trajectory and said nothing about mine. The phone calls where I said, "Things are fine," and meant it, and also meant so much more than that. You can be genuinely proud of your life and still grieve the version of it where someone who is supposed to see you actually did. Here's what I've come to understand about cause and effect in a situation like this. When you protect someone from the consequences of their own assumptions, you are not being kind to them. You are being kind to yourself. It's easier to stay invisible than to stand in the light and watch someone squint. I told myself I was protecting Daniel's day, and that part was true. But I was also protecting myself from having to watch my father not understand, and that part took me longer to admit. The thing about Colonel Bridges speaking up is that it forced something I'd been deferring for years. Not a confrontation, not a reckoning. Just a moment of plain fact, dropping into a room where fiction had been living comfortably for a long time. The fiction wasn't malicious. That's the strange part. My father didn't lie about me out of cruelty. He lied, or rather, he assumed, because he had never developed the habit of asking, and I had never developed the habit of insisting. We both had work to do. That's the only way I know how to say it. What I know now, sitting on the other side of that airport drive, is that integrity isn't just about what you do at work or in uniform. It's about whether you let the people in your life see enough of you to actually know you. I've been so busy building a self, I was proud of that. I forgot to show it to anyone who mattered. That's not discipline. That's just a different kind of hiding. Daniel always knew. He knew because he was paying attention, and because he's the kind of person who pays attention to people he loves. That's its own kind of intelligence, the emotional kind that no promotion can give you, and no rank can measure. I want to be more like him in that way. My father called me 3 weeks after Fort Benning. We talked for 40 minutes. He asked about Germany. He asked what an interagency task force actually does. He asked if I liked the work, which no one in my family had ever asked before. I told him the truth, which was yes. Most days, genuinely yes. That's where we are now. Not fixed. Not the same. Something new, which is its own kind of better.